The littoral zone of a body of fresh water includes the shallow shoreline region and the adjacent deeper water section, where we find floating plants at the surface and submerged plants below. Close to the reeds and rushes, the water is still relatively shallow, and there are plant species that can be rooted in the sediment below while their leaves float on the surface, exposed to sunlight. One of the dominant species in this zone is the water lily. Lilies have stems out of which their umbrella-like leaves grow, and they are rooted to the bottom of the pond. Their leaves and flowers create many different microhabitats that attract a range of different animal species. They also provide a surface upon which birds, insects, frogs, etc. can rest and move. There are also many different types of free-floating plants with roots extending into the water below, but not reaching the bottom. Free-floating plants are able to make use of the bright sunlight to grow quickly and spread rapidly across the pond's surface. Because of this, they are often the first plant to colonize new areas of the pond when conditions are good. Plants are autotrophs, or primary producers. This means they are able to make their own food by photosynthesizing, or converting sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water into organic compounds and oxygen. This process forms the basis of all food webs. The energy for photosynthesis comes from the sun. Primary consumers access that energy by feeding on the plants, and secondary consumers, in turn, get their energy by feeding on the primary consumers. This is the start of a simple food chain. Biologists categorize the different stages in a food chain by trophic, or feeding level. So a food chain describes the feeding relationships in an ecosystem. For example, algae are primary producers. Snails feed on the algae and are known as primary consumers. Primary consumers, which are always herbivores, eat producers. Birds eat the snails and are secondary consumers. Secondary consumers eat herbivores. They are lower-level carnivores. Higher-level carnivores are tertiary consumers. For example, a large bird of prey like a hawk will consume smaller carnivores such as small birds. Anything that dies falls to the bottom of the pond to be consumed by fungi and bacteria, the decomposers. Another pond food chain might look like this, with more layers of tertiary consumers. Food chains are easy to follow, but often lack detail because simplified feeding paths are rare. Food webs provide more of a descriptive model for how energy flows between organisms. However, feeding relationships are very complex, and a food web model is rarely able to incorporate all the energy pathways moving through the system. In a pond ecosystem, energy flows between different zones through food webs. Animals that live in one zone can eat animals or plants that live in another zone, transferring that energy to a different area. An egret, for example, might feed on fish taking shelter under plants in the littoral zone, but spend most of its time in the terrestrial zone beside the pond. Or terrestrial insects that land on the surface of a pond might be eaten by fish, transferring their energy from the surface to the submerged region of the pond. In the upper section of the littoral zone, where the floating plants live, there is a diverse community of plant and animal life that make the most of the warm, shallow waters where sunlight penetrates. But beneath the surface of the water, conditions change. As with the floating plant community of the littoral zone, the shallow water around the edge of the pond, sunlight is able to penetrate to the bottom, allowing plants to thrive. providing plenty of food and cover for a variety of aquatic animals. But in the deeper water of the littoral zone, where sunlight is not so abundant, submerged plant communities are found. Everything here is adapted to underwater conditions. No longer needing to resist gravity or wind, submerged plants are soft and slightly buoyant with thin roots. Without water, they collapse. Like land plants and floating plants, aquatic plants also photosynthesize, producing oxygen that is dissolved in the water rather than the air. With masses of water plants, including algae, a pond becomes an oxygen-rich environment for aquatic fauna, like these tadpoles. Like all animals, these tadpoles need oxygen to breathe. Submerged plants keep oxygen levels high enough to support large numbers of tadpoles and other animal life. As primary producers, aquatic plants also provide the food that consumers in the food web rely on. But large numbers of primary consumers, like tadpoles, attract predators, and the threat of attack is constant. An egret stalks the shallows looking for a meal. This time the tadpole is lucky. The egret has found a far larger prize hidden in the shallow water. Many abiotic components of ecosystems, such as nutrients and other chemical elements, are continuously cycled through biological communities, keeping the ecosystems in balance. Before they metamorphose into frogs, tadpoles breathe by extracting oxygen from the water, by passing it over their gills. The plants in this pond release enough oxygen to support many tadpoles and other animals that live in the water. During a different process called cellular respiration, the cells in their bodies combine this oxygen obtained through breathing with organic compounds derived from the plant material they consume. This releases energy to the tadpoles. Carbon dioxide, water, and heat are byproducts of this cellular respiration. The underwater plants make use of this released carbon dioxide to photosynthesize, and so the cycle continues. Animals use the products of photosynthesis to obtain energy for growth and movement. At the same time, carbon dioxide and water is given off, completing the cycle. In this way, carbon is cycled through the ecosystem. Biological cycling of abiotic factors is important for keeping a healthy, balanced environment. If the system is too one-sided, the cycle breaks down and the ecosystem suffers.